Two capitals, two operating systems, two cities, two capitals of old money, and two completely incompatible operating systems for keeping a fortune alive across centuries. In London, a family can sit on the same 6,000 acres for 400 years, produce almost no visible income, wear the same tweed jacket their grandfather wore, and still be, by any serious measure, one of the wealthiest families in the country. Their wealth doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need to. The land was there before the family had to prove anything, and it will be there after. In New York, a family can build a fortune in 20 years, put their name on a hospital wing, a university library, and a museum gallery in the same decade, and be considered old money within 2 generations, provided they do it correctly. Because in New York, old money isn't a bloodline. It's a badge you earn through visible, strategic, repeated demonstrations of taste and civic weight. These aren't just different styles. They are 2 entirely different technologies for wealth preservation, built on 2 different legal systems, 2 different class structures, and 2 philosophically opposed ideas about what money is even for. London's system is built on land, title, primogeniture, and discretion. It optimizes for continuity. It was designed, quite literally engineered, through centuries of property law to make sure a fortune could never be broken apart, no matter how many children a family had or how badly one of them behaved. New York's system is built on liquidity, meritocratic churn, and visibility. It was designed, or rather it evolved, to reward whoever could build the largest fortune fastest, and then to launder that fortune into legitimacy through philanthropy, marriage, and institutional capture, all within a single lifetime if necessary. Neither system is better. Each one solves a different problem, and once you understand the mechanics of both, you'll never look at a British estate or a Fifth Avenue name plaque the same way again. This is the mechanism-level breakdown of the London-New York wealth gap. Not the mythology, not the Downton Abbey aesthetic, not the Gossip Girl aesthetic. The actual architecture underneath both systems, and why one produces quiet permanence, while the other produces spectacular, visible, and sometimes short-lived dynasties. If you've ever wondered why British wealth feels invisible and American wealth feels loud, the answer isn't culture, it's law. Subscribe, because we're about to go through 4 centuries of property statutes, tax code, and inheritance mechanics that most people will never encounter unless they're already inside one of these families. The London operating system, land, title, and the architecture of continuity. To understand London old money, you have to stop thinking about money and start thinking about land. For most of English history, land wasn't an asset class among many. It was the asset. It produced rent, which produced income, which produced political power, because for centuries, the right to vote and the right to sit in Parliament was directly tied to land ownership. Wealth, status, and governance were the same system wearing 3 different hats. The mechanism that made British old money durable wasn't cleverness. It was a legal instrument, the strict settlement combined with the practice of primogeniture. Primogeniture meant the entire estate passed to the eldest son, not divided among children, not split between siblings, but handed intact to one person. This is the single most important divergence from the American system, and we'll come back to why. A strict settlement then went further. It didn't just give the eldest son the estate, it legally restricted what he could do with it. He couldn't sell the land. He couldn't mortgage it freely. He was, in the technical language of English property law, a life tenant. He could enjoy the income from the estate during his lifetime, but he held it in trust for the next eldest son, who held it in trust for the next, in an unbroken chain. This is why so many British estates survived wars, recessions, and reckless heirs that would have bankrupted an American family in a single generation. The system was designed with the explicit assumption that at least one heir per generation would be incompetent, addicted, or simply uninterested, and it built legal walls around the asset so that person couldn't destroy it even if they tried. Entail, the formal term for this restriction, was gradually dismantled through a series of reforms, most significantly the Law of Property Act of 1925, which modernized land law and made strict settlements far harder to create going forward. But by then, the families who mattered had already been running the system for 200, 300, 400 years. The habits, the trust structures, and in many cases, the actual land were already locked in. Then there's the second pillar, the honors system. Titles in Britain were never just decorative. A peerage came with a seat in the House of Lords, until reforms in 1999 dramatically reduced hereditary peers' automatic right to sit. But even stripped of formal political power, titles function as a permanent credentialing system. Duke, Marquess, Earl, Viscount, Baron, that signals lineage instantly, the way a surname alone cannot. An American can build a fortune larger than most dukedoms and still never acquire what a title communicates instantly, that this family has been in for centuries, not decades. The third pillar is the club and school system, Eton, Harrow, Winchester. These aren't just expensive schools, they're multi-century-old networks that place a boy at age 13 into a cohort he will interact with for the rest of his life, in Parliament, in the city, in the regiments, in the clubs. Oxford and Cambridge extend that network into adulthood. Then the gentlemen's clubs of St. James's, White's, Boodle's, the Carlton, provide the adult life infrastructure, places where business is discussed without ever looking like business is being discussed, where reputational vetting happens over lunch rather than in a due diligence report. And underneath all of it sits discretion as a status signal. In London old money culture, visible spending is read as a sign of insecurity, not success. A family that has held a title and an estate for 400 years doesn't need a logo. The house itself, half-collapsed roof and all, does the talking. This is the British old money code. The less you appear to need people to know you're wealthy, the more secure that wealth is assumed to be. The result of all these mechanisms working together, primogeniture, entail, titles, closed schools, discrete clubs, is a system almost perfectly optimized for one thing: continuity across centuries, even at the cost of liquidity, growth, and modernization. British old money families are frequently land-rich and cash-poor. Many stately homes today survive only because they've been converted into wedding venues, open to the public through the National Trust, or turned into corporate retreats. The system preserved the asset. It did not necessarily preserve comfort. This is exactly the kind of mechanism most financial content never covers, because it's not about picking stocks. It's about the legal architecture of permanence. If you want the full breakdown of how dynasty trusts, grats, and modern equivalents of the strict settlement work in the U.S. today, that's a separate deep dive on this channel. Go watch it after this one, because the American version of this story is about to look completely different. The New York operating system, liquidity, churn, and manufactured legitimacy. New York old money was never going to look like London old money, because the entire legal foundation underneath it, was built to prevent a British-style aristocracy from ever forming. The American Revolution wasn't just a political break from Britain. It was a legal break from the property system that produced British aristocracy. Several states abolished entail and primogeniture explicitly in the decades following independence, precisely because the founding generation viewed hereditary land monopolies as incompatible with a republic. Thomas Jefferson pushed for the abolition of entail in Virginia, specifically because he saw it as the legal mechanism that manufactured a permanent aristocratic class. Without primogeniture, American estates were legally required, by default, absent a will directing otherwise, to divide among children more or less equally. Without entail, there was no mechanism to prevent an heir from selling, mortgaging, or squandering an inherited estate. This single legal difference explains an enormous amount of the cultural gap between London and New York wealth. American fortunes fragment by design. Every generation, a fortune split among 3 or 4 children becomes 3 or 4 smaller fortunes. This is the actual mechanical root of the American saying, shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. It isn't really a story about moral decay or spoiled heirs, though that's the popular narrative. It's substantially a story about a legal system that mandates division rather than consolidation. So how did American old money survive at all? 2 inventions: the trust, imported and radically adapted from English law, but repurposed for a country without primogeniture, and the family office, an entirely American innovation. The Rockefeller family effectively created the modern family office model in the early 20th century, a private, dedicated organization whose sole purpose was managing the family's capital, tax exposure, philanthropic vehicles, and generational transitions as a unified enterprise, functioning almost like a private bank owned by one family. Where the British estate used land and legal restriction to prevent fragmentation, the American family office used professional management and trust structures to prevent fragmentation, achieving a similar end through completely different means. Then came the second, and arguably more culturally important mechanism, philanthropy as a legitimacy engine. Because America had no honor system, no peerage, and no formal aristocracy, new fortunes from railroads, oil, steel, and finance faced a specific problem. Money alone didn't buy social legitimacy. The Astors, Vanderbilts, and later the Rockefellers, Carnegies, and Fricks were, in the eyes of established East Coast society in the mid-1800s, simply rich, not respectable. The mechanism they built to solve this problem is one of the most important in American old money history: convert liquid capital into permanent, visible, named institutions. A university library, a hospital wing, a museum wing, an opera house. Each one solved 2 problems simultaneously. It removed capital from a taxable estate, decades before the modern charitable trust structures existed in their current form. Philanthropy was already functioning as a wealth preservation tool, and it converted money into a permanent physical monument bearing the family name, which functioned as a manufactured substitute for the multi-century pedigree that a title would have provided in Britain. Andrew Carnegie articulated the underlying philosophy directly in his essay on wealth, arguing that a fortune should be distributed by its owner during his lifetime for the public good rather than simply passed on, and that dying wealthy without having done so was, in his framing, a kind of failure. This wasn't just personal ideology, it became a template. The Frick collection, the Carnegie libraries built across hundreds of American towns, the Rockefeller funding behind the University of Chicago, these weren't incidental acts of generosity. They were the mechanism by which raw industrial fortune got converted into permanent, respectable, quasi-aristocratic status within a single generation, something that in Britain had required 300 or 400 years, and an actual title granted by the Crown. The third American mechanism is the manufactured pedigree school system: Groton, Chapin, Spence, St. Paul's, Choate. These schools were founded specifically in the late 19th and early 20th centuries by the newly wealthy industrial families to create an American equivalent of Eton, a closed, expensive, multi-generational network that could manufacture the appearance of old lineage within a generation or two by controlling who your children's classmates would be. Endicott Peabody, founding headmaster of Groton, built the school explicitly around English public school models, importing the aesthetic and social function while stripping out the actual centuries of accumulated lineage, because there was no way to import that part. Then, feeding directly out of these schools, the American aristocracy funnels into the Ivy League, not because Harvard and Yale are simply good schools, but because for old New York money, they function as the adult stage extension of the Groton-Chapin network, the same way Oxford and Cambridge extend the Eton-Harrow network in Britain. The final layer is the American equivalent of the London Club. Manhattan institutions like the Knickerbocker Club, the Union Club, and the University Club, which function almost identically to White's or Boodle's private, expensive, and far more about social vetting than the stated purpose of dining or squash. What makes the New York system fundamentally different from London's isn't the presence of these mechanisms. It's the compression. Britain's system took centuries to build and was largely inherited rather than designed. New York's system was consciously assembled, institution by institution, philanthropy by philanthropy, within roughly 2 generations, by families who understood explicitly that they were manufacturing legitimacy rather than possessing it by birthright. And crucially, it remains an ongoing open system. In London, you essentially cannot become old money. The entire point of the system is that it's closed to new entrants except through marriage into it. In New York, a sufficiently large fortune, deployed correctly through the right schools, the right philanthropy, and roughly 2 generations of patience, can still buy its way into the same social category. This is arguably the single most important structural difference between the 2 cities, and we'll come back to exactly why that door stays open in New York and stays shut in London. The philanthropy as tax and legitimacy mechanism we just covered is still running today, just with more sophisticated vehicles, donor-advised funds, private foundations, charitable remainder trusts. We've done a full breakdown of how modern old money uses anonymous philanthropy specifically to avoid the visibility problem while still getting the tax benefit. Link is in the description. And if you want more of these mechanism-level breakdowns, this is exactly what this channel exists to do. So subscribe if you haven't. The legal fork: why one system closed and the other stayed open. Let's put both legal systems side by side, because this is the actual fork in the road that produced everything else. Britain, historically, primogeniture as default. Entail permitted, legally enforceable for generations at a time under strict settlements. Titles created by the Crown, inherited by strict succession rules, and, critically, impossible to purchase. Land as the dominant store of generational wealth, subject to relatively stable property tax treatment for centuries relative to income. America, historically, no primogeniture by default, equal division among heirs, unless a will specifies otherwise, and several founding-era states explicitly abolish the practice. No entail permitted or heavily restricted, meaning any heir could sell or encumber inherited property freely. No hereditary titles. The U.S. Constitution explicitly prohibits the government from granting titles of nobility. Liquid capital, factories, railroads, stock, and later financial assets, as the dominant store of wealth, which is inherently easier to divide, sell, and also easier to lose. Notice what this produces. The British system's core design goal was to prevent any single generation from being able to break up the asset, even if they wanted to. The American system's core design goal, intentionally as a piece of anti-aristocratic political philosophy, was to prevent any family from being able to permanently entrench an unbreakable asset across generations. Jefferson wanted estates to fragment. He saw it as a feature, not a bug, of a healthy republic. This is why the modern American answer to "how do I keep this together" had to be entirely different from the British answer. Britain solved it with property law restricting alienation. America, unable to use that tool, solved it with trust law repurposed for a different job, and specifically with what are now called dynasty trusts. Irrevocable trusts designed to hold assets for multiple generations, historically limited by the common law rule against perpetuities, which required a trust to terminate within a set period, roughly a life in being plus 21 years. Here's the mechanism-level twist that most people miss. Several U.S. states, South Dakota, Delaware, Nevada, and a handful of others, have since abolished or dramatically weakened the rule against perpetuities specifically to attract trust business. This means a dynasty trust settled today in South Dakota can, under current law, legally run for centuries, sheltering assets from estate tax at every generational transfer point, in a way that would have been impossible under traditional common law. In effect, several American states have engineered a modern statutory replacement for what Entail did in Britain, a legal wrapper that lets a fortune stay intact indefinitely, except this version is voluntary, contractual, and available to anyone with sufficient assets and the right lawyer, rather than being tied to an inherited title or ancient landholding. This is the single most important convergence point between the two systems, and it's almost never discussed outside of trust and estates law circles. Modern American dynasty trusts are functionally recreating what British entail did 400 years ago, just through contract law instead of property law, and available by purchase of legal services rather than by birth. The title system, though, has no equivalent workaround. You cannot purchase your way into a dukedom. The British honor system remains, even after devolution of most political power from hereditary peers, a closed, non-transferable signal of multi-century belonging that no amount of American capital can replicate, which is precisely why old New York money still, even today, occasionally pursues transatlantic marriages into aristocratic British families. Not for the money, since by the 20th century, many British-titled families had far less liquid wealth than their American counterparts, but for the pedigree conversion. The most famous version of this exchange is the so-called dollar princess era of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when American industrial fortunes married into cash-poor, land-rich British aristocratic families in a mutually beneficial trade, American liquidity for British lineage. If any of this dynasty trust, or entail mechanism sounds like something you want mapped out in full, including how GRATs and buy, borrow, die strategies interact with these structures today. We've done full dedicated breakdowns of each, linked below. This channel exists specifically to make this kind of legal architecture understandable to people who were never taught it in school. So if that's useful to you, the subscribe button is right there. The Visibility Code. Why London whispers and New York builds monuments. Now we get to the part most people actually notice, without understanding why it happens. The completely opposite relationship each city has with visible spending. In London old money culture, the operative principle is what sociologist Pierre Bourdieu would call symbolic capital, operating in inverse proportion to economic display. The less a family appears to need to prove its wealth, the more secure its position is assumed to be. A threadbare Barber jacket, a dented Land Rover, a stately home with peeling paint in the East Wing. These aren't signs of financial trouble to someone reading the code correctly. They're read as evidence the family has nothing to prove, because the family has been established for so long that recent performance is irrelevant to their status. Thorstein Veblen's concept of conspicuous consumption, developed studying the American Gilded Age specifically, essentially doesn't apply to British old money in its purest form, because British old money's signaling strategy is the mirror opposite, conspicuous non-consumption, or as some sociologists have termed it, quiet luxury, long before that phrase became a marketing term. New York old money, especially in its formative Gilded Age period, ran the opposite code, and Veblen's theory of conspicuous consumption was built almost entirely by observing it directly. The Vanderbilts built the breakers in Newport, a 70-room cottage modeled on Italian Renaissance palaces, specifically as a visible, undeniable statement of arrival. Mrs. Astor's famous 400, the list of New York families considered acceptable society, reportedly capped at 400 because that was the capacity of her ballroom, functioned as an explicit, visible gatekeeping mechanism, publicly ranking who counted as legitimate society and who didn't. This was wealth performing itself as a public spectacle, because in a system with no inherited titles, visible spectacle was the only available proof of arrival. But here's the mechanism-level nuance that separates old New York money from new money, and it's crucial. The visibility isn't random consumption. It is philanthropic and institutional visibility specifically. A third-generation Rockefeller or Whitney wasn't judged on how many houses they owned, but on which boards they sat on, which museum wing bore their name, which university they funded. The signal shifted, generation over generation, from "look how much I can buy" to "look at the permanent institution I built," and that shift itself is a marker used within New York society to distinguish first-generation new money from multi-generational old money. New money buys yachts. Old money endows chairs at Columbia. This is why London and New York old money, when they actually meet each other, at Davos, at a transatlantic wedding, at a country weekend, frequently misread each other completely. A British aristocratic family sees a New York family's museum wing and reads it as slightly desperate, an unnecessary announcement. A New York family sees a British estate's crumbling roof and shabby furniture and initially misreads it as a family in financial decline, before recalibrating and understanding that in London's code, that shabbiness is itself the flex. Both systems agree, however, on one thing completely. Neither system respects new, visibly branded, logo-driven consumption. A British old money family and a New York old money family will both look down, for exactly the same underlying reason, on someone wearing an outfit covered in a designer's monogram. The difference is what each culture considers the acceptable alternative signal. Invisibility in London, institutional permanence in New York. We've covered London's quiet luxury code and the psychology behind why old money dresses down in a dedicated video on this channel. The same Bourdieu and Veblen frameworks referenced here, applied specifically to how you can actually spot old money versus new money in person. Go watch that next, and subscribe if this kind of pattern recognition breakdown is useful to you. It's the entire premise of this channel, where the two systems are converging today. Here's what almost nobody covers about this topic, and it's the most interesting part. The London and New York systems, for the first time in roughly 2 centuries, are actively converging. The mechanism driving this convergence is globalization of both capital and education. 3rd and 4th generation members of old New York families now routinely attend university in Britain, LSE, Oxford, Cambridge, and old British aristocratic families increasingly send children to American Ivy League institutions, partly because a British degree alone no longer carries the same exclusive global currency it once did, and an American Ivy League credential now functions as an internationally recognized status marker in a way Eton and Oxford alone don't fully replicate for global business contexts. The family office model, invented by the Rockefellers as a distinctly American structure, has now been adopted almost universally by British aristocratic and landed families as well, precisely because it solves the modernization problem that pure landholding couldn't, converting an illiquid, undiversified estate into a professionally managed, globally diversified portfolio, while still preserving the underlying land and title as the symbolic core. Many British stately homes today are run less like inherited family seats and more like operating businesses with multiple revenue lines: weddings, film location licensing, agricultural diversification, national trust partnerships, managed by the same kind of professional family office apparatus that Americans pioneered. Meanwhile, dynasty trusts of the kind pioneered in South Dakota and Delaware are now used by wealthy British and international families, specifically because U.S. trust jurisdictions currently offer some of the strongest asset protection and perpetuity terms available anywhere in the world, meaning the American legal innovation designed to replace Entail is now being used, in some cases, by the same families whose ancestors' entail it was originally invented to replace the function of. And critically, both cities' old money now converges physically in the same handful of locations. The same private members' clubs in London now count American finance families among their membership. Manhattan's most exclusive co-ops increasingly count British aristocratic families among their residents. Both groups' children now attend the same small handful of international boarding schools. Both families' capital sites inside the same small set of private banks. Historically Coutts in Britain, historically J.P. Morgan's private bank in America, many of which have themselves merged, been acquired, or expanded across both markets over the past several decades. What hasn't converged, and likely never will, is the title system. No amount of American capital, family office sophistication, or Ivy League pedigree manufactures a dukedom. That door remains closed by design. The entire mechanism of British peerage depends on scarcity and closure, and any attempt to open it would destroy the very thing that makes it valuable as a signal. This is the one piece of old money architecture that cannot be reverse engineered, no matter how much liquidity you bring to the table, and it's precisely why transatlantic marriage between American fortune and British lineage remains one of the only functioning exchange mechanisms between the two systems, even in the 21st century. Two answers to the same question. Strip away the accents, the architecture, the schools, and the clubs, and both London and New York, old money were solving exactly the same underlying problem. How do you make a fortune outlive the person who made it, and outlive the natural human tendency toward division, mismanagement, and decline? London answered that question with land, law, and closed lineage, a system built for permanence at the cost of flexibility, that produces families whose wealth is centuries old, but whose cash flow is sometimes surprisingly thin. New York answered it with liquidity, institutions, and manufactured legitimacy, a system built for flexibility and renewal at the cost of permanence, that produces families whose wealth is more volatile across generations, but whose capacity to rebuild, rebrand, and re-enter high society, even after a setback, is far greater than anything the British system allows. Neither city ever solved the problem completely. London's oldest families have, in many documented cases, sold off land, artwork, and titles-associated estates simply to cover maintenance and inheritance tax bills that their own legal architecture never anticipated needing to pay at this scale. New York's original Gilded Age dynasties, the Astors, many branches of the Vanderbilts, have in several well-documented cases fragmented into relative obscurity within 4 or 5 generations. Precisely the shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves pattern their own legal system was mechanically designed to produce. The families that have actually lasted the longest, on either side of the Atlantic, are the ones that quietly borrowed from both operating systems, British-style discretion and multi-generational patience, combined with American-style professional management, diversification, and institutional legitimacy building. That hybrid is, if you're looking for the actual answer to how do I make wealth last, the closest thing either city has produced to a solved formula. This isn't hidden, it's just never taught, not in London and not in New York. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next.